All objects are perceived by the senses. The senses are in turn perceived by the mind. The mind, in turn, is a movement that unfolds in consciousness. Consciousness is not perceived by any other structure. It is its own perceiving. The objects perceived by the senses appear to be constantly changing, while the senses which perceive them appear to be stable and unchanging. On close inspection, however, the senses are realized to be constantly changing, while the mind, which perceives these changes, appears to be stable and unchanging. Upon close inspection, however, the mind is seen to be constantly changing. The constantly changing mind can be seen due to the unchanging nature of consciousness. Consciousness is unborn, ever present and unchanging. All changing phenomena arise within unchanging consciousness. The sense of ego-I, which arises within the mind, takes itself to be conscious. The sense of ego-I, a movement of the mind, appears to be aware because it has identified itself with consciousness, within which it arises. This sense of ego-I-ness identifies itself with consciousness because of three factors. 1. The movement of the mind within consciousness. 2. The movement of thought within the mind. And 3. Ignorance of consciousness as the underlying ultimate reality. The misperception of the sense of being a separate ego-I ceases upon the realization of the existence of consciousness. During waking and sleeping, the I thought believes in the notion of being a separate self. But during deep sleep, the belief in being a separate self disappears. The I thought, and sense of being a separate self is but a modification that arises within the mind. The mind, identified with its own movement of ego-I-ness, imagines an externalized world because of its association with the sensory organs, which, like the mind, are but modifications that arise within consciousness. Who am I? What am I? Where am I? When am I? How am I? How is this world created? And who is the creator? This is the way of inquiry as to what is the ultimate truth. I have a body, but I am more than this body. The body is comprised of the 5 elements, but I am more than these 5 elements. I have these 5 senses and mind, but I am more than these 5 senses and mind. This is the way of inquiry as to what is the ultimate truth. The misperception of separation dissolves when, through inquiry, separation is discovered to be only the product of the mind's identification with its own thoughts, especially the ego, I thought. Identification with the belief of separation gives rise to limited understanding. Limited understanding creates a veil wherein the mind splits unity of consciousness into 2. An internal perceiver that believes itself to be separate, and a perceived separate external world. The mind splits unity of consciousness into perceiver and perceived. The perceiver, which is only a thought, then identifies with the belief that it is an empirical self, separate from a perceived external world, which again is only a conceptual projection of the mind. Misperception arises when the mind identifies with its own movement of thought and projects the belief that it is a separate self. mind believes itself to be a perceiver who is separate from what it perceives. When the mind awakens to this misperception, the belief in being a separate self disappears. What was all along non-existent is recognized to be non-existent. Unity of consciousness is conceptually divided by the mind into perceiver and perceived, subject and object. The division of subject and object is misperceived by the mind to be real. When consciousness is realized, all division is understood to be only a product and projection of the mind as thought. Every object is composed of 5 elements. These elements appear to exist as separate phenomenal aspects, but are not separate from their home ground, consciousness. The first 3, space, air, and fire, resemble consciousness due to their spacious nature, while the latter 2, water and earth, appear more solid. The 5 elements make things appear as separate and different. Yet everything, earth, water, fire, air, and space, which come together to form everything animate and inanimate, nature, animals, humans, and even the gods, are only projections of the dividing mind arising in consciousness. Name and form are merely concepts or thoughts, but they can serve as pointers back to consciousness in which they arise. When consciousness is recognized and awakens to itself, there is uninterrupted abiding as consciousness, even as name and form continue to arise. There are 2 types of concentration which may be practiced for realizing the ultimate truth of non-dual consciousness. 1. Object-centered concentration, and 2. Object-less concentration. The first may be divided into two types: concentration that is associated with thought, and secondly, concentration associated with sound. All movements that arise in the mind are to be treated as objects. I am being, awareness, bliss, unattached, self-luminous, and free of separation. This understanding is known as inquiry, in which ideas are present. Savikalpa, samadhi. Inquiry in which the mind is free of distractions and attachments to objects of the senses and mind is known as freedom from thoughts, nirvikalpa samadhi. A mind that is free of thoughts is steady, like the unflickering flame of a lamp that resides in a place free from the wind. Here, there is indifference to changing objects on account of the complete absorption in being, awareness, bliss that accompanies consciousness awakening to itself. All objects, whether perceived as external or internal, arise in unconditioned consciousness. All objects are pointers to consciousness, which is revealed when the mind's fascination with objects is relinquished. Consciousness is unconditioned, unchanging, and unlimited by space, time, name, and form. Uninterrupted inquiry upon consciousness, in which every object arises, reveals the unconditioned, unchanging, and unlimited nature of consciousness. The mind remains undistracted by arising objects when the unconditioned, unchanging, and unlimited nature of consciousness is recognized. Then one awakens to the pure being bliss equanimity of consciousness. When absorption in and as consciousness is steady and uninterrupted for a long time, establishment in non-separate consciousness is close at hand. inquire through the 6 stages of absorption, which give rise to awakening to the truth of non-separate, non-dual consciousness. All external and internal objects are changing. World, body, senses, and mind. All changing objects appear and disappear in unchanging consciousness. With the recognition of unchanging consciousness, identification with changing objects ceases. Through meditative inquiry, all objects are realized to be ever-changing projections of the dividing mind. Constant abiding as consciousness dissolves all misperceptions. Then the heart opens, all doubts resolve. Suffering ceases, and there is liberation from the notion of being a separate self. What is the nature of the separate self? When consciousness is realized to be all that there is, that consciousness is ultimate reality, the separate ego I is realized to be only a mental concept. The individual sense of self only appears to be separate and limited because of the way the mind categorizes and conceptualizes perceptions. This misperception of the I-self as a separate and limited individual occurs both in the waking and dream state. The belief of separation, which engenders the notions of confusion, imperfection, and limitation, is based on the mental misperception of the mind, which takes itself to be a separate self. But consciousness is ever free of division. It is always whole and undivided, being devoid of parts or separation. Ultimate reality is omnipresent, unlimited, complete, timeless, and all-pervasive, under all circumstances, always. The notion of separation and limitation are merely thoughts produced and projected by the mind that arise in consciousness. The notion of being a separate, limited, and finite self arises as a mental, emotional perception because of the mind's projection of and identification with the felt sense of limitation. When the projections of the mind are traced back to their origin, the notion of separation is healed, misperception ceases, and separation dissolves as the unreal notion that it is. Consciousness is whole and without parts. Statements such as, "Thou art that thou art, I am consciousness, this self is consciousness, consciousness is ineffable, and I am that ineffableness," reflect the truth of non-dual consciousness. The notion of being separate, finite, and limited is not found in either the descriptions or realization of consciousness. The illusion of separation, which is brought about by the two aspects of projection and ignorance, arise within consciousness. The experience of separation appears to divide and limit the indivisible and unlimited nature of consciousness, and makes it appear as the world of separate objects and embodied separate I selves. The mind fallaciously appears to perform various actions, as well as enjoys their results in the erroneous form of a separate individual. The mind divides what is not two into a universe of separate objects of enjoyment, which consist of various combinations of the 5 elements and 3 gunas. The sense of being a separate ego I self, who experiences a separate universe, exists in time. But time is the creation of the dividing mind that splits what is outside of time into the notion of past, present, and future. The notion of being a separate self, who is aware of a separate universe, is only conceptual and remains true only until awakening as consciousness. Both self and the world are merely projections of the mind and are cognized to be real only if the mind projects, identifies with, and believes in the notion of separation. The mind projects the existence of the individual in the waking state, and then imagines it afresh in the sleep and dream states. The individual and world that are cognized in the dream state are illusory. When dreaming ends, the dream self and all the dream objects are realized to be merely products and projections of the dreaming mind. While the dream self believes that the dream world is real, the waking self believes that the dream world is unreal and the waking world is real. But both these selves are only passing projections of the mind, ephemeral concepts that come and go. Consciousness is the underlying reality, devoid of separate selves. The mind, as a separate self, believes that the waking world is real. But this subjective world is unreal, as it disappears during deep sleep. The three worlds of waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep are ephemeral appearances. The real self, consciousness, underlies and therefore transcends the three states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. When consciousness is realized to be the underlying reality behind all states, the world of objects is realized to be merely projections of the mind, arising in the mirror of consciousness. As long as the belief in separation exists, the notion of causality exists. In awakening from the dream of separation, cause and effect dissolve, as they are recognized to be only unreal projections by the mind. The qualities of water, such as wetness, fluidity, coldness, sweetness, wave, and foam, are inherent in water and are not separate from water except as conceptual names and forms. So also, being, consciousness, peace, and bliss, which are the qualities of consciousness, appear to be inherent in the so-called separate selves that reside in the waking and dream states. From the standpoint of consciousness, there are no waking or dream selves that are real, but only projections of the mind. The characteristics of a separate self and a separate world are merely superimpositions upon unconditioned consciousness. All differences, like wetness, foam, wave, coldness, fluidity, and sweetness, are non-separate characteristics of the underlying essence of water. The characteristics of water have no existence separate from the water from which they arise. All these characteristics appear and disappear in water. All characteristics of water are only aspects of their consciousness, water, and all are only projections of the mind. Upon waking from the dream state, all characteristics of the dreamer, such as existence and consciousness, dissolve and are realized to be only projections of the dreaming mind. Just so, upon awakening, all separate characteristics of the self dissolve and are realized to be only projections of the mind. As foam and wave have no existence separate from water, so also the entire universe, consisting of the separate self and the objective world, have no existence separate from the mind. In truth, all that exists is non-dual consciousness.